Is everybody in?
Hi all.
Good evening. We're just letting people come in. I was just going to wait about another 30 seconds. So welcome. So glad you all could join us this evening. Does it look like everybody's in, Michael?
People are still joining. Liana Kassar is joining.
Okay.
Okay.
We have 35.
Oh, we have Louisa Boatwright from the Newport School Committee.
And June Speakman.
Yes. Good evening, June. And Rep McGaw. I see.
And
Rep
Sue Taylor.
McGaw. Yes, and
And Sue
Susan Taylor
Susan.
from the Newport City Council.
No, she's no longer on the city council.
Oh, from the chair of
chair of the
the
Dems.
Newport Democratic Party
Mhm, mhm.
Town
City
Committee.
committee.
County,
Yeah,
right,
the city.
City
committee.
Committee.
So yeah, Terry, we're at 38. If you want to.
Okay.
Thank you,
Well,
Mike.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our first 2022 meeting of the Aquidneck Island Climate Caucus. As many of you are return visitors, but for those that don't know, Rep. Lauren Carson and myself, I'm Rep. Terry Courtfriend. I represent District 72 in Portsmouth, the east side, southern part of Portsmouth and east side of Middletown. And Lauren and I have been having these climate caucus meetings. This is our third year. So we've discussed a myriad of environmental topics. And the reason was we really wanted to bring what's happening in Providence back to the island and to be able to hear your voices and then to bring that back up to Providence with us and be aware. So we're very excited this evening to welcome for a second time a return visit, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. And we also have State Senator Dawn Euer, and they're going to discuss their participation in COP26 just a couple months ago. And we have a long list of questions. And we were recognizing as people logged on, some of our colleagues from the House and other elected officials with us. Do you want me to go through those quickly, Lauren?
Yeah, yes.
We have Rep. Liana Kassar. We have with us, we have Rep. Susan Donovan, Rep. June Speakman, Rep. Michelle McGaw, Town Councilor Linda Yuzafuja from the Portsmouth Town Council, Tim Sweeney from the Bristol Town Council. We have Maria Mack from the Planning Commission in South Kingstown, the Planning Board. And I hope I got everybody. You can send me a message if I missed anybody. Oh, Louisa Boatwright from the Newport School Committee. And with that, Lauren, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to see everybody here tonight. We got the idea a couple months ago to have a discussion about the Glasgow event from someone here in Newport. They wanted to hear directly from Dawn and Senator Whitehouse. It was
Sheldon's fine.
Sheldon's fine, thank you. It was obviously a real honor to have Rhode Island represented and Newport represented for those folks that live in Newport. I just want to add that, Terry and I have been doing this for a few years, and we also want to try to build a voice from Aquidneck Island. I know there's some folks on the call that aren't from Aquidneck Island, and you're always welcome here, but we really wanted to build some kind of unity on the island around climate related issues. So that's what we've been trying to do and bring information. We're open to future topics. If you'd like to drop us a note, we usually meet about every 2 months or so, and it's usually on a Sunday evening, particularly during COVID. So glad you're all here. So the first thing I'm going to do is introduce Sheldon, who's going to share with us his experience in Glasgow. Then we're going to hear from Dawn and share her experience with that. We'll take maybe about 20, 25 minutes to do that. And then Terry and I will lead a discussion with the questions that had been submitted. We got a lot of questions, and we're going to stay focused on the climate questions. Some of them were a little off topic and equally important, but we want to make good use of Dawn and Sheldon's time as it relates to climate. So Sheldon, it's all yours. Thank you again for joining us the second time.
Great. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Terry, and thank you to all the other fellow electeds for joining, and thank you to everybody who is on the call. I don't need to make the pitch for climate change action in this crowd, so let me just go straight to what I thought some of the key things were in Glasgow. The first of all, I'm a big fan of John Kerry. I think he's the American in government who's done most for climate, bar none, going away. And his ability to untangle with China the climate issue from all the rest of the resentments and irritations that exist between our countries, so that the Chinese were willing to go forward taking climate in a side lane without having to invoke every other complaint they have about us or vice versa, was a really big deal. And getting them to stop financing fossil fuel plants was a really big deal. And that conversation is continuing. So I thought that was big. The focus on methane was new and very welcome. I've been pushing for a methane fee for a long, long time. And an international focus on methane came. We need to actually have that resolve itself into something, but it's great to see methane as a climate pollutant much higher up the agenda on the radar screen. There was more pressure on the financial services sector to quit greenwashing and actually get serious about climate investments. And I thought that came through quite well. And then from my personal point of view, I am really sick of the trade associations in America, which almost without exception are either nowhere or terrible on climate. And that includes groups like the Insurance Association, which is paying the check when climate disasters happen. The Bankers Association, the same guys who are warning us about carbon bubbles and economic meltdowns. Bankers Association doesn't lift a finger. The Chamber of Commerce is my enemy. National Association of Manufacturers is my enemy. Actually, the American Petroleum Institute is better than most other trade associations, which is peculiar as all hell, but that's the way it is. And what was interesting about Glasgow is that a lot of the big CEOs were there. And so outside of Glasgow itself, I went to events where the trade associations and their big CEOs were all in the same room, and I could trash the trade associations in front of their CEOs so that they had to kind of fess up to what they were doing. And I think, in my world in Congress, a CEO can make a statement about climate and we probably won't even know it happens. And they get together as the Business Roundtable and they put out a nice press release from, New York, and it's noted, but it really doesn't make an impact. The people who make an impact with members of Congress, particularly Republican members of Congress, are the big corporate trade association people who are there day in and day out, who they know will be there or not be there in the next election, who've got the horses to act politically. And when they are all either silent or secretly saying, don't do a thing, then that's a huge part of the problem we have here. So being able to blow them up was very, very good. And of course, it was great to see Dawn there, who was flourishing and having a great time every time we saw each other. So with that, let me hand it off to her.
Thank you so much, Sheldon. And thanks to Terry and Lauren for the invite, and great to see everybody on the Sunday night. Yeah, so I had never been to a COP before, and I basically, the way that I got invited was I got invited by this group, the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan environmental group that works to support state legislators as we work on environmental priorities. And so I went with another colleague from Colorado, a state rep from Colorado, and a state senator from Hawaii, and another state senator from Washington State, who all had worked on climate legislation in their respective states. So one of the big pushes from the United States was really trying to reestablish our standing on the international stage around this issue, and really focused on and talking about the progress that states have been able to make in the interim of the hiccup of the last 4 years on that issue. So I think that to me was incredibly interesting. I was on a number of panels, both talking about again state action, obviously talked about Act on Climate and the work we've done in Rhode Island. And also I was actually invited on a couple panels to talk about carbon pricing. That was part of the international conversation about the treaty negotiations. And so we were having panels on that and how it had been working in different states. Unfortunately, we came back to the news of again, another hiccup on the Transportation Climate Initiative. But while I was in Glasgow, and we were trying to continue to keep TCI alive and actually promote the concepts around carbon pricing to be a tool to address the climate crisis. I will say that I was Sheldon is I think being even a little bit modest in his comments about his discussions with the businesses and the trade associations. I was at the event that he was at, and I also want to thank Sheldon and his staff for helping make sure that I could get to Glasgow, because obviously with COVID, credentialing was a little bit crazy, and so they helped kind of smooth things through for me, and I really appreciate that. And so one of the things I was able to do was to be able to go to the panel that he was on, talking to business leaders about action on climate, and to watch him dress down an entire room full of business leaders on exactly what he was just talking about was quite impressive. So it was also interesting to talk to some of the business leaders afterwards who were not so pleased at his comments, but he's right. And to be honest, we see the same thing on the state level with a lot of corporations and companies who have very big climate statements within their corporate mission, but then are the first ones to come in opposition at the state house with their lobbyists. So, I think that one of the biggest takeaways for me from Glasgow is really just the need for that urgent action at all levels of government. I think, through the climate disinformation and misinformation efforts, there's been this, kind of push around, private action, what individuals can do. This isn't something that we're going to fix through individual action. We need governments at all levels to be engaged in resolving this problem. And I think, that to me came across very clearly at Glasgow. And so it was great to connect with leaders from around the country and from around the world who are all working on climate in their respective jurisdictions. I think, the question that I came away with is that with all of the other priorities that come before us, how do we make sure that climate considerations get incorporated and integrated into everything that we're doing? Because it's just such a crisis, and it's not going to be resolved by kind of a one-off focus here and there. It needs to be a concerted, ongoing effort. So I know that I'm in a virtual room full of people who care about this issue, and so and I know that you're all advocating for it and came here to because you support action on this issue and are part of the Aquidneck Island Caucus, Climate Caucus, because of your support on that. But I think as we're moving forward in our legislative session and as we see Congress moving forward, I think figuring out, we've got this big influx of money from the infrastructure bill and from the ARPA funds. And so something that I've been talking to my legislative colleagues about is how do we make sure that on a state level, we're incorporating climate considerations into all of that spending and making sure that that continues to remain a focus. So with that, I will stop because I know that there were a lot of questions, and I look forward to a dialogue.
Dawn, I have a question. Could you describe for us, like, how many people were there, how the days were structured, and what kind of, what was going on outside the room? I know there were thousands of people outside, the international feel of it. Could you just give us a sense of that before we move on?
Sure. So in many ways, it's set up like as a conference, just as any other trade or any specific focus conference would be. So there were obviously the very formal convenings and meetings happening between the negotiators and between the heads of states, and different countries would have their own sub meetings to kind of hammer out different parts of the negotiation. And kind of alongside all of that was this very vibrant conference that was happening. And so there was in the event center, there was basically a room as you would anticipate. Just imagine like the convention center, and that the convention center would be full of different tables. They called them pavilions. People, different companies, different nonprofits were there to sponsor pavilions, would have their own panels, members to come in and present. Much of it was live streamed because of COVID. They restricted the amount of passes that were and credentials that were given out. So that, I don't know how many at the end of the day of the credentials, but I'll say that to get into the event center, you had to go through, both the security check and then the ID check and things like that to get into it. And then basically it was just like a very, very busy conference, just like any other thing. And I'll say that was one of the hardest things to keep track of. They had themes for every day. So, one day they focused on buildings, they focused on transportation. So they had different focuses every day for the conference participants. And a lot of the pavilions did live streaming. So it was interesting to kind of try to keep track or figure out where you would want to go each day. And, I worked, again, because I was on a couple different panels. So I tried to coordinate my schedule around, had to coordinate my schedule around that. And also, definitely gave some thought to, things I wanted to learn about or people that I wanted to connect with, that I could bring things back to Rhode Island with me.
How about outside? What was going on outside?
Yeah, so outside it was actually interesting. I know that there were a lot of protests, and I think that, it kind of depended on the timing as to when you got to the event center, as far as whether or not you would see the protests. And I think some of the days they actually staged the protests away from the event center itself on days when I think they knew that there were going to get a lot of crowds in the protest. Because, I think there was, security concerns. And I think the protest organizers, wanted to make sure that there wasn't, any serious issues while still being able to raise the profile of the issues and what they were protesting about. So I think that, we definitely would also get notifications if there were different, transportation lines shut down because of protests or things like that.
Wow.
But there were pretty consistently, a group of people outside of the security gates that were protesting, had the megaphones, doing, different speakers or, music, protest songs, things like that outside.
Wow. One last question before we go to the questions. How did they deal with the language barriers?
That's actually some of the different pavilions would have, headphones that there would be translation. A lot of stuff was in English. And then, different people had interpreters with them. So I think a myriad of different ways.
Thank you. Terry, you want to start with some of the questions unless you have some of your own?
Muted, Terry.
I had one question that you touched on, Sheldon. I was reading about the banking industry and the pros and cons of that. Do we want them under the tent? Do they then become the policy makers? I read like an article that was a pro and an article that was a con, that they thought it was a positive thing to see banks moving in this direction. This particular article was about a bank in England, I think called NatWest. And then I read an opinion piece that thought that this this should really remain in the hands of the policymakers and that we shouldn't let the banking and slash insurance industry run away and create the policies for us. So do you have a comment on that?
Well, from a policy point of view in Congress, I'm not all that interested in hearing from the banks because when they come to Congress, they come through their trade association, which isn't interested in climate. And they've got such a crap record that they don't, carry any weight and shouldn't carry any weight. Unfortunately, through the Trump years, American financial regulators lagged way behind the rest of the world, and the Fed lagged way behind the rest of the central banks in terms of putting pressure on banks to be disciplined about how they went about dealing with their climate portfolios. And one thing I'll give the Biden administration credit for is that I think they're catching up pretty fast on that. I would obviously always like to see them go faster. And I wish Jay Powell was less of a milquetoast on this subject, but they're bringing in a lot of other people who are very strong on climate to surround him. And I think that's going to be the outcome. So because we were so weak, the things that the banks did on their own, I wanted to encourage because every step counts, everything that somebody can do helps. And the banks have a big leveraging factor because if they say, we're not going to finance any more fossil fuel plants, that's a big deal. If they say we're going to favorably finance renewable plants, that's a big deal. If they sell out and don't trade in fossil fuel stocks, that's a big deal. And so getting them to move matters. And when they do move, I think they should be encouraged.
I kind of agree with that. Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
I'll move on to, we have quite a few questions about Build Back Better. So maybe you could give us, instead of me reading each individual question, maybe you could give us an update on Build Back Better. And and one question too is there any thought of breaking Build Back Better into smaller bite-sized pieces?
Two top lines. First, I don't really know where the hell we are because we're dependent on two Democratic senators who don't really know where the hell they are. So it's really complicated in that sense. Because Build Back Better is only able to proceed as a reconciliation measure, a budget reconciliation measure, we have that tool because we went through the process in the budget committee and we brought that to the floor and we did the all-nighter of Votorama, and now we've got this tool before us to use. But it's only one bill that you can use. So if you break it up, you're throwing things over the side that then have to get into the last reconciliation that we have for this Congress, or that have to hit a 60 vote margin or otherwise get agreed to. So there's not a whole lot that you can split up except into next year's reconciliation, which we could start working on now if we wanted to. But Leader Schumer is completely unwilling to have that conversation, even in very close circles, because he doesn't want to send the slightest hint that we're not going to proceed with this Build Back Better on this reconciliation measure. So that's the posture that we're in. And in that posture, I'm working every side of the equation, trying to get friends in the House to amp up the House's ambitions on climate and to push back on the House areas where they have kind of let things go not very strongly. I'm a real thorn in the side these days of the Biden White House, trying to get them to up their ambition and their effort and their performance. And I'm on, a first name basis with Schumer's climate team because we're essentially integrated. I've got a group of myself, Brian Schatz of Hawaii and Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, who have been just persistently advocating on climate constantly. And we've more or less merged our staff with the Schumer staff on climate. So we're really, really well engaged with the leadership staff. And so between our leadership, House leadership, the White House, and then the stuff that we're doing on our own to raise hell and keep pressure on, And I also have a conversation that is going on with Manchin to try to figure out where he is and move him along. So I'm operating on all sorts of fronts to try to make sure that if we can get a Build Back Better going, it has really serious climate stuff in it.
Sheldon, do you
Thank
think that if when Build Back Better passes, that might be it for climate this year? What other things are you working on? What
It
are you
depends.
hopeful for?
It depends when it passes and what's in it. I think the reconciliation measure that we're operating under right now expires in September. So we have all through the summer to finish whatever Build Back Better is on this measure before it dies of its own legal accord. But we also have one that we could bring up and then do a second reconciliation. However, if you have until September and there are only 3 months left in the year to do a whole new reconciliation in the last 3 months, you know, with the election going on, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you could just put it into the major bill. You know, we're not going to get around Manchin and Cinema just because we put a new reconciliation up. They're going to have the same problems and concerns. So I think the target still is to use this reconciliation measure. Plus, you know, these voterama nights are really pretty brutal for some of our members. You know, we got members who are in their 80s. And to have to pull an all-nighter voting every 15 or 20 minutes while you're in your 80s, that's not easy on these folks. And so if we went to another reconciliation, we'd have to do 3 voteramas, whereas now we only have to do the 1 for Build Back Better. And people actually are talking about, you know, God forbid we lose a member to these damned voteramas, and then we've got now we're down to 49. We don't have a majority while they sort out who the next senator is going to be.
Right. So, Dawn, coming off of your experience in Glasgow, what are your legislative priorities, or how are they shaping up? I mean, you know, for everyone on the call, the Rhode Island legislature just started meeting last Tuesday. We're all pretty engaged in writing legislation. Dawn and I successfully passed the Act on Climate last year, which is really moving us in a very aggressive direction. Dawn now has a wealth of knowledge that I hope she's going to share with me. And like, where do you see us going, given the parameters of Act on Climate and what you saw and learned about in Glasgow?
Yeah, so I think, you know, obviously, you know, Act on Climate, by the end of the year, we need to have that greenhouse gas report updated, and that's largely going to be relying on the agencies to do that update. But, you know, I've always believed we need to be able to walk and chew gum on this thing. You know, we need to wait. The reports are going to be done under Act on Climate, and there's also stuff that we can do legislatively. So I think one of them is we need to pass the 100% renewable energy standard. That's going to codify the executive order that Governor Raimondo had passed, putting us towards 100% renewable energy by 2030. You know, so I think, you know, I think Glasgow really confirmed for me that we need to be kind of thinking about this in sectors and, you know, trying to have aggressive implementation strategies in each sector. I think the transportation sector, again, like TCI, that's a huge drawback. But I think that there's some funding to do infrastructure planning and transportation planning that I think that Rhode Island should go for, to really make sure that we're embedding our climate goals into our transportation sector, similar to how you know, the Department of Planning did a planning document about transportation, but I think we need to do a climate transportation plan, and, you know, holistically look at, you know, both our public transit plus how our roads are and bridges are built, because that, and then on top of that, there's the electrification conversation. So EV vehicles, having the incentives for those, and also the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure is going to be really key. And then on the building sector, I think that there's a ton of work to be done in the building sector. So I think, you know, the climate, the bond, the school bond to have a bond that would get us towards net zero pathways for our school buildings. I think that would be huge. Plus, it's a much needed investment in our school infrastructure, but starts to get us towards tackling the building sector. So, thinking about, and then I think there's just a ton more to do on buildings. I think that, there's the home heating sector transformation report that we need to start implementing. That's the thing, is that Rhode Island, we don't have a shortage of reports. We need to start implementing this stuff. So looking at, and Governor Raimondo, to her credit, did a ton of work on that, of different reports. Now we just need to dust all those reports off and get some implementation in place.
That's true. You're absolutely right. Terry, you're up next.
Thank
Do you want
you.
to take a question next?
Yes. What can you say about nuclear power? We got a couple of questions, people asking, is nuclear power, do you see that as part of the solution?
Yeah. Yep. The first thing we need to do is to stop closing safely operating nuclear plants to replace them with fossil fuel natural gas plants. That has to stop. And in a lot of states that has stopped, but we need to continue to make sure that we don't swap out clean energy for polluting energy. We're also working on smaller modular reactors and a next generation type set of reactors that could actually go through our fossil fuel, our nuclear waste stockpile and reutilize it to power new generation. So there's a lot of innovation happening and a lot of restructuring at the Nuclear Regulatory Council to try to get all that going. And it's going to be expensive. It's never going to be the best thing, but I'm in the mood right now where this is such an emergency that we've got to point everything we have at the problem until we really are sure that we're on a path to planetary safety. And until we're on that path and it's clear, I think we've got to keep nuclear as a very important part of our portfolio. It's about, I don't know, depending on where you are, 20 to 40% of the portfolio. So it's a big deal.
Yes, thank you,
Thank you.
Sheldon. Dawn, to what extent was there an emphasis on health when you were in Glasgow? And can you speak to any work that's being done here in Rhode Island to connect climate advocacy, climate policy to health and even the environmental justice community?
Yeah, so there definitely was a huge focus on environmental justice. In fact, more people were talking about that than I've ever heard before. And I really see that environmental justice really is the intersection of environmental considerations and human health impacts with an overlay of racial and social justice. So I think that, our climate bill, by the way, Act on Climate, does have considerations in it that needs to be part of the planning process, and it needs to be considered. It needs to be considered as part of the process. And globally, I talked to folks from all over the place who are talking about environmental justice, and often the communities who can least afford to be dealing with the burdens of climate change and that impact are often those communities on the front line that are dealing with it more heavily. Again, not to belabor the point on TCI, but
You can explain what TCI is. I'm not sure everybody knows what that is.
Yeah, so TCI is the Transportation Climate Initiative, and it basically was looking at creating a regional cap, a fee on pollution and a cap on pollution coming from the transportation sector. And it started actually it was a bunch of Republican governors who put forward the initiative about 10 years ago, and then spent about 10 years talking about it until folks started backing out of being part of that compact in the last couple months. So basically, that was kind of something that folks regionally were kind of hanging their hat on as far as how to deal with the transportation emissions. And here in Rhode Island, Rep. Korchevend and Senator DeMario had actually put forward their bill, and that would have formally implemented some of the programs on the state level that were required as part of the regional compact. And they actually talked about it in that framework of human health, because they, the same pollutants that cause climate emissions, it's no mistake that the communities that live near those polluting industries or live near roadways, have high asthma rates. It impacts, human health. So it's really kind of trying to tackle the same problem. When you're looking at trying to tackle the climate emissions, it does have that health impact as well. So I actually give Terry and Alana a lot of credit for recognizing that in their transportation bill and trying to move it forward with that recognition in mind. We also, in the Senate, we passed the Environmental Justice Act that actually would require the Department of Environmental Management to consider human health impacts, cumulative human health impacts, before citing new polluting facilities, which would again have that human health impact. It also would have a climate impact, as those, the permitting would be considered. So, and again, it was just a huge topic of conversation. Almost every panel I went and watched, they had conversation as part of the panel. They would talk about the environmental justice impact. And I think that's how we need to tackle it, because we need to be intentional about talking about it, making sure that it's part of every conversation and doesn't get left behind.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank
Terry?
you. Okay, I'm going to read this question. This is from one of my constituents, Thomas Euer. He's a transportation, he's very interested in transportation. So I'm going to read this. Do you think, and it might be more for you, Dawn, do you think there are ways to make progress in climate control and emissions improvements that can be implemented directly by state agencies in the very short term and not require legislative action, such as optimizations made by the DOT to traffic patterns and roadways, or the modernization of state agency IT infrastructure to reduce the need to drive across the state to file paperwork that we should be able to do online?
I'll turn this over to Dawn, but I'll make one observation before I do, which is that the Public Utilities Commission, as a state agency, is going to have to sign off on the sale of National Grid. And that puts them in a position to get the buyer, PPE, to put together what its climate plan is going to look like for Rhode Island. And we have both a huge problem and an interesting asset in that space. Our huge problem is that we are amazingly dependent on natural gas, and particularly for winter heat. And to get off natural gas is a really, really big move. And if all we had was a natural gas company, they'd be looking at, a survival problem. But because National Grid owns all the natural gas in Rhode Island and also all the electricity, the switch from natural gas to electricity stays within their company. So it's a rare opportunity to be able to get a company to focus on a dramatic shift from natural gas to electrification of things that natural gas now serves in Rhode Island, and figure out how to do that. So I hope the RIPUC is very aggressive and forward leaning about that. And a former staffer of mine is a staffer there who I think is really bright. So, I've got to, there's cause for optimism, but it's got to be done.
Thank you.
And I'll just piggyback on that by saying that, part of the Act on Climate was directing directive to the agencies to consider Act on Climate and the priorities in their agency decision making. And so there's actually been, the CRMC has referenced it in public hearings, the DPUC has referenced it. The Division of Public Utilities and Carriers, the Coastal Management Resource Council, the Energy Facility Siting Board. I mean, there's been at least 3 different petitions that have been heard or have been opened in different state government quasi-judicial agencies where they're going to be making determinations that will have an impact on our climate goals, and so Act on Climate and the related goals have been brought up. It's actually one of the things that I'm most proud of, and I want to give Hank Webster a shout out, because I know every time Hank sees the Act on Climate mentioned in one of these proceedings, he shoots me a quick text so that I am able to keep track of them. But it's one of, we don't all the time see that direct impact so immediately on legislation that we passed, but that's one thing that I'm really proud of about Act on Climate, is has that immediate effect. The other thing that I will say is that, I think that the agencies, again, they make spending decisions. DOT is a huge one. We're not going to, the transportation piece, how our roads and bridges are constructed, the design of them, along with the availability of public transit and the convenience of public transit, the safety and ability of people to be able to walk and bike safely. That's, the safety and convenience factor is how people make their transportation decisions. And that all comes down to infrastructure spending. And that, those are agency decisions that don't require and aren't directed specifically with legislation. I know that the current governor has asked all of the agency heads to submit their budget with climate priorities in mind, and with the Act on Climate goals in mind. So I'm really looking forward to this upcoming budget cycle. I've actually been, my colleague Chair Pearson, who's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, I have been pushing him that we should have some joint environment committee hearings with the finance committee hearings, so that we can, take a look at those budgets and kind of talk about the climate priorities as we look at the spending. But, the other thing I'll say, and this is back to the transportation piece, but it's also, just government decision making. The move over the years away from downtown and over to the Pastore Center, that has had a huge impact on transportation. I know that it takes folks, if you need to get to the Pastore Center from Newport via the bus, it takes you 2 hours. Who's going to do that? So we have decisions to make as far as, where government services are available, and, trying to coordinate those with public transportation. That's not something, again, that requires legislative action, but I think the agencies can be working with RIPTA around, hours, and as the Department of Administration is, vetting different buildings and properties.
Yeah, and in the infrastructure bill that passed last year, there's a fair amount of money that goes to some of the things that Dawn is talking about. And some of us on this call, some of my House colleagues, we've been looking at that money to see how it's going to be invested, to ensure that it's invested in compliance with the Act on Climate. That's really what I'm asking for, that as we make these investments in infrastructure, transportation, roadways, the whole host of things that we're going to be paying for in the next 3 to 5 years, that we remember that we have to comply with the Act on Climate. And the Act on Climate, as Dawn said, also sort of has little fingers that go to all the different state administrative departments, requiring them to take some steps to reduce carbon. So we're on the right track, at least for the moment we are. I'm going to ask a question of both senators, and that is that I know that most people on this call, I know them, and I know that they are, committed to climate resiliency and sustainability for ourselves and future generations. Do we have enough momentum on our side? How much more work do we have to do sort of with what would be called the non-believers? Have we picked up traction in the past, say, 3 to 5 years? What do you think about that, Senators?
We clearly have nationally, and the numbers show it, but Congress has been very resilient to that change in the public opinion, largely because there is a very elaborate fossil fuel funded political apparatus that surrounds Congress, that props up Mitch McConnell with tens of millions of dollars of money. This is one of the unsung horrors of Citizens United. When you let unlimited money into politics, and particularly when you let it be hidden, then big industries that want lots out of politics, like don't do climate legislation, get enormous power to stop things. And so that's what we've been up against. And I think the main battle that I see myself as having is trying to disable those groups and expose them to the light of public opinion. It's not just that public opinion has to shift, it's that the shift in public opinion has to be deployed against that apparatus so that it withers or gets blown up, and then we can move forward. It's pretty disgraceful the way the fossil fuel industry continues to fund this behavior. And it's pretty disgraceful the way the rest of the corporate sector basically whistles while this is going on, because they've got their own tax issues, their own regulatory issues. You know, they don't want to really be bothered with climate at the lobbying level. And so there's nothing there. And that's why I keep focusing on these trade associations and on the lobbying, because that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where I think we'll really, when there's a breakthrough, it'll be a big breakthrough because that has happened. It'll be because the Chamber of Commerce finally said, all right, we're throwing in the towel. We will tell our people that they've got to do a carbon bill.
Yeah, I think, I do think that we've made progress again on public opinion. And I think that, you know, on the state level, what I see happening is that, you know, it becomes one of so many priorities. And, you know, obviously we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and, you know, now there's all these conversations about, you know, the state's flush with cash. And, you know, what is that spending going to look like? So I think, you know, climate is one of those things where I think it's a higher awareness and higher focus on younger generations. And I don't know that the urgency always makes its way as well to the members of the General Assembly. I think that the interesting thing, you know, when I talk about when I talk about climate with some folks, you know, it's some of my colleagues who are just like, you know, but we have this issue with, you know, the different, you know, testing right now with COVID and the back to school stuff. And, you know, it's just, you want us to do what? There's still the treatment of climate as kind of this like other fringe environmental thing that we're talking about as opposed to something that needs to be core in what we're addressing and keeping the focus on. And so, you know, I think that, and I also think that the trade groups locally are very good at pivoting any conversation about climate back to cost. And they very quickly convince everybody that all of a sudden it's going to be a consumer related cost. And, you know, again, on the TCI bill, on the Act on Climate, on anything with the utilities that we're looking to reform, the first question that I will get is, how much is this going to cost consumers? And my first response is always, I don't know. Why don't you tell me how much X, Y, and Z company paid out last quarter in dividends? Because if you can tell me that's less than a few $1 million to their shareholders, then I will entertain the conversation about consumer costs. But, you know, I think that there's definitely more awareness, but we definitely have a long ways to go.
Yeah, and what concerns me here in Rhode Island locally is that I'm concerned that our colleagues in the legislature are going to go, well, we passed the Act on Climate, everything's all fine, we're leaving it to the departments to go take care of it. And this Act on Climate is really just step one in a
Right.
longer step for the next 28 years to get
All
us.
those different sectors that
Correct.
Dawn was mentioning before need to be addressed. And that goes, most of that goes, I think, through us in the
Well,
chambers.
one thing that's going to happen is that the predictions about flooding 30 years out are going to start to collide with mortgages
Right.
and
Mhm.
with home insurance. And that's going to start to hit coastal property values hard.
Right.
Freddie Mac has been warning about this for nearly a decade now. And when that happens, and realtors are seeing it, and, you know, Washington Trust is seeing it, and, Local budgets are seeing it. Then suddenly everybody's going to come rushing in and say, why didn't you do more earlier? But that's a very immediate, I think, tipping point that we've got coming at us, because we're getting to the point where if you look 30 years out, there are properties that shouldn't be mortgageable or insurable now.
I agree with you. That's something that I've had my eye on also, Sheldon.
Mhm.
There was a
Well,
good
you
article
represent the
that-
point, so you're
Yep,
one of
that's
the,
right.
core areas. You're ground zero.
There was a great article in today's Washington Post about how if you're buying a house, how to ensure that it's disaster proof, which I clipped and saved for future discussions. And it talked about like how people buying houses can begin to ask questions about the vulnerability of their property, given the changes in climate. I was really thrilled to see that article. I think it's really where that conversation has to go. I just sent it off to emergency management today in Rhode Island. I want to talk to them about this because it's something that I'm really concerned about.
And I
Terry,
don't know if it's a good
Good.
sign or a bad sign, but the big banks are buying up all the little firms, engineering firms and forecasting firms that do these predictions so that they'll have the very best information at their disposal,
Oh, in-house.
which puts consumers at a disadvantage compared to the information advantage the banks will have, but it at least gets the bank's attention.
Well, while we're on that, and Representative Speakman's on this call, I don't mean to call on her, but Warren has done an outstanding job. That was our last climate change, our last Aquidneck Island Caucus discussion, where we looked at what Warren is doing in terms of really identifying those properties that are being regularly flooded now. They looked at the value of those properties. They looked at the taxes on those properties, and they're starting to talk about how to move people from those flood prone areas that they're seeing tremendous flooding now, not in 30 years. And I would love to see more of Rhode Island communities take a look at that kind of planning. It's a real kudo to Warren and their leadership on this.
Yeah.
Apparently, they're one of the only towns in New England that's actually taken this conversation to that level of research and applied the layers of economic information across the flooding and climate change in layers. And it's really striking. And I'd like to see us take some steps on that in the Rhode Island legislature, give them more.
We showcased them in my Energy and Environment Notions Day, and they hit it out of the park. It was really
Oh, I'm
wonderful.
sure, I'm
You-
sure.
I noticed that. I noticed that.
You know,
Yes.
people are interested in that. The Warren Planning Committee has a YouTube channel and their presentation is there, which is where I saw it. And
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing, actually, to see how they've used a lot of different points of view to really capture what the economic impact is going to be to the community, as well as people's property. Once
Right.
the flooding's happening now there. It's not 30 years. It's flooding there now. And the roads and even the emergency roads taking you out of the town are going to be tremendously impacted, and they need to be rerouted in state roads. It's a really big issue. Thank you, Sheldon, for bringing that up, because I'm really trying to figure out how to do some policy on that. Terry, I think we have time
Yes.
maybe for one or two questions.
Okay. I'm going to read this one as well. What is the best way of integrating the programs and the funding of the layers of government across the many sectors of our economy and our lives that cause and impact carbon emissions as we move to a holistic, zero carbon, circular economy world? That's a big topic. I don't know if we have enough time to answer that, but
It's actually, to me, a pretty quick answer. I think there are two, and I think they're related. And the first is to make sure that when people are polluting in a way that damages the climate, they pay the price of what they're doing. That's really simple economics. It's conservative economics. It's Chicago school conservative economics. And we just have to do it. And whether it's a methane fee or a carbon price or a charge to airlines and shipping lines for what they emit, you do that, and suddenly there's a massive price signal going out throughout the economy screaming, fix this, fix this, fix this. And innovation will arise and come to, rise to the occasion, come to the party and start changing things. And the way you do that within the government is with relatedly what's called the social cost of carbon. And one of the things I'm hammering at the Biden team is that they're a year in, and I told them to put the Obama social cost of carbon back in place, and they did that right away, but they've got to update it and they've got to deploy it throughout the agencies of government. And when you bake that social cost of carbon like a carbon price into every agency decision throughout the government, you start having really big impacts in budgets you wouldn't expect, like transportation, like defense, like interior. So those are the two places where I think if you keep your eye on the ball there, we're going to see a huge, 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 huge difference. They're the two things I think without which you fail, although doing them isn't a guarantee of success. They're necessary, but perhaps not sufficient.
Don, you agree on the state level?
Yeah, yep.
Okay.
Maybe we just could get some closing remarks from the two senators. We'll start with you, Senator Euer. If you want to just some closing remarks as it relates to Glasgow and right in our backyard here on Aquidneck Island.
Yeah, so I definitely know that I am preaching to the choir with this group, but you know, what my takeaway from Glasgow really is that we need that kind of sustained effort, all levels of government. And so, you know, for the folks on this call, I think, you know, you're here with elected leaders who are definitely, you know, working on this issue and, you know, focused on this issue. I think making sure that you're talking to your own senators and representatives, letting them know that that climate action is a priority for you, and you know, just continue to stay involved with the Climate Caucus. And you know, again, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Terry. And you know, always great to be with Sheldon. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Dawn. Great to be with you. And thank you also, Terry and Lauren, for hosting this. And again, all my colleagues on the call, thank you for not only being here, but staying through to the bitter end. I would just make 2 points. One, the failure that we've had in Congress to address climate change adequately for a decade has everything to do with dirty politics and dark money. And if Citizens United had gone the other way, or if the Supreme Court had actually enforced its fake prediction that this was going to all be transparent, we'd be in a very different political situation. But hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in anonymous money have flooded into the system, and they have really bollocked things up. So while we're busy trying to keep climate pollution out, we also got to remember the political pollution that put us in this predicament. And that is a battle that I try to make progress on every day. The second is that while Rhode Island has the difficulty being a small state, and so if it sets new standards for itself, it's hard to survive the border problem with Massachusetts and Connecticut. But what we can do, and what we have done, is do things by example. And I think Dawn's bill is a thing that we've done by example. I think what CRMC did, getting the offshore wind siting exploded after we figured out how to do it, was Rhode Island leading by example. I'm hoping that this acquisition with the RIPUC of the gas and electric facilities of National Grid provides yet another opportunity for big leadership. And we've got a lot of potential, but we're also about as exposed as any state that there is. We've got more coastline for landmass than almost any other state. I think Alaska says it competes with us on that, but they're also the least populated state in the country, and we're the second most populated state in the country. So the human harm of what's going to happen to our shoreline and coastline in the next 20, 30 years is going to be unparalleled. And so it's really hugely in our interest to keep our eye on the ball and keep working at this and get it done and show the world how to do it right.
Thank you, Sheldon.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheldon. We
Thank
appreciate
you,
your.
Dawn, too. Thank you to everyone. It's just about 1 hour now.
Thank
Terry,
you all.
remarks? Yes, thank you, Sheldon.
Yes.
Any closing remarks, Terry?
Well, I'm just so glad to have both the senators with us and so many people joining along, and stay tuned. We'll be in touch in the next couple months about I'm sure we're going to come up with another topic, maybe infrastructure spending, or maybe we'll take a look of some of the legislative bills that get introduced that involve the topics we've been talking about tonight. So just stay tuned and we will definitely be reaching out to all of you and we appreciate you being here. And thank you both again to our senators.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank you.
wonderful evening.
And I see Bob Morton is on. Congratulations, Newport Biodiesel, on being acquired.
Yes.
Yes, I saw Bob too. Hi, Bob.
Congratulations, Bob.
Okay, everybody, have a wonderful Sunday evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks so much.